So welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Karen Corman and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the UIC Alumni Association. Welcome to the UIC Alumni Exchange Series. Each week, we work to bring you a variety of programs and topics so you can explore, connect, and even escape from the everyday with a community of UIC alumni, staff, and faculty experts. You will hear me say this just a few times today, but I encourage you to visit go.uic.edu/alumni exchange for the latest and greatest programming. And with that, I'm excited to start our program this afternoon, featuring a wonderful panel of experts from the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs, or otherwise known as CUPPA, who will address how our local, state, and national governments are dealing with the impact of COVID has had on our communities as they present coronavirus and its economic impact and silver linings. We are grateful to be joined by our panel today and also to be led by the Dean of CUPPA, Mike Pagano, who has been in his leadership role at UIC for over 14 years. Dean Pagano, I will turn it over to you so you can introduce our panelists and begin the program. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Karen, for the introduction, and welcome to everybody who's online and I think in a position to understand or try to understand what is happening in the world around us that has changed so dramatically over the last 6 or 7 months, if we can remember back that far. Let me begin by setting the stage, and then I want to introduce each of the three panelists. First, just to remind you that until around March or so, we were thinking about the next day or the next week, and since March we've been thinking about every day as the unemployment, the numbers of unemployed hit over 30 million people within a 2-month period. The United States government responded with the CARES Act that contributed nearly $3 trillion to in relief and aid, which amounted to about 15% of gross domestic product, which is a huge investment on the part of the United States government. In contrast to earlier recessions, such as the one that we used to refer to as the Great Recession, the amount of the ARRA Act that the Obama administration implemented only amounted to 5% of GDP. So it's an enormous investment that the federal government has made in the economy and in state and local governments. State and local governments, however, and that's what this panel is about, state and local governments have been clobbered because of their reliance on certain taxes that have in many cases dried up. The HEROES Act was passed, which amounted, the HEROES Act was proposed but not passed, and the purpose of it was to provide somewhere between $500 and $800 billion to provide support to state and local government. While this was, which was not approved, by the way, while this was happening, we also entered into a period in which the George Floyd murder made very apparent to everyone that there is an underbelly to the economy and to the society that is rooted in racism, that is rooted in racial injustice, and is rooted in disparities. And that's what we're going to be talking about as well today. One of the things that we do know that state and local governments, their reactions to changes or shocks to the economy, such as we've just experienced, is that they'll do three things right off the bat, and they've done all of those. One is that they will draw down their savings account or their reserves or their rainy day funds. Second thing they'll do is they'll start slowing down on capital spending, especially when the resource base for the capital is cash or tax revenue as opposed to bond revenue. And the third thing they will do is they will stop or they will not fill the vacant positions that they have open. So with that as a quick background, we have three terrific panelists who are going to provide you with an overview of what's happened at the economic level, at the fiscal level, and at the practical level of trying to deal with day-to-day problems. First of all, we have, and our first speaker will be David Merriman. Professor Merriman is the Stuckel Presidential Scholar, a professor of public administration, and a senior scholar at the Institute for Government and Public Affairs. David's published over 50 to 100 articles and chapters in books, and he's certainly an expert in the area of tax increment finance. Following his presentation about the economy and the changes in the economy due to COVID-19, we have Amanda Cass, who's the Associate Director of the Government Finance Research Center in CUPPA, and who is also a PhD candidate who will earn her degree sometime this academic year from the Department of Urban Planning and Policy. Amanda's expertise in the area of debt and retirement systems and a host of other fiscal issues. And finally, the third presenter will be Daniel Espada, who is the first ward alderman with the city of Chicago and is completing his degree, his master's in urban planning and policy, again from CUPPA, and will soon be in the ranks of where all the rest of you are, and that is an alumna or an alumnus of this great institution. So with that as background, the format for today is I'm going to turn the microphone, whatever that is, over to David Merriman. David's going to talk about the economy. If you have clarifying questions that not probing questions, but you need information, please put it in the chat, and Karen will read that back to David so that he can respond right away before we go to the second speaker, who is Amanda Cass. And the same thing with Amanda. If you have clarifying questions, send them to Karen right away so that they can be forwarded to Amanda, who can answer them. And finally, Daniel will be speaking about the experiences of a city alderman in the city of Chicago. After that, it'll be open to Q&A for everyone to join in. So with that as a brief overview and introduction, I turn it over to David Merriman. David?
Hi. Yeah, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank the Alumni Exchange for setting it up and Mike for that kind introduction. Yeah, our topic today is the coronavirus and particularly its economic impact and the disparate parts of that economic impact. So I'm going to try and keep with that theme. So the first thing is just, and Mike sort of gave you a little bit of an introduction about what has happened, but I wanted to put this in a historical context a little bit. This is a graph that just shows Illinois, an index of the United States and Illinois output, which we call gross domestic product. And it goes from 2005 through the most recent data we have, which is lag just a bit. We don't have data from the most recent quarter. And what you can see is that both the US and Illinois have been on a growth path. The Illinois has been growing somewhat slower. And then we had a pretty devastating fall off in output because we essentially closed down the economy in early March. And as you can see, in the second quarter of 2020, from March to June, the US lost about 1 year's worth of GDP growth. And in the same period, Illinois lost about 14 months of growth. So Illinois was hit harder than the US and has been lagging behind the US in terms of growth. And these are big. They're very, very big changes, but also they shouldn't be exaggerated. If you look at where the US is now compared to where it was even a few years ago, even 3 or 4 years ago, we have still bigger GDP. And in some sense, that's remarkable given the disruption as a result of COVID-19. What's I think more interesting or more concerning is the impact on particular groups of people. So as you probably know, going into the pandemic, we were at historically very, very low rates of unemployment. And this shows female unemployment rates for white and Black women, starting from March 2020, which is right before the pandemic, till almost the present day. And what you can see, of course, is that there was a huge upsurge in both unemployment rates, but the upsurge was harder for Black women or bigger for Black women than it was for white women. And although we don't have time to talk about all of the details, if you look across the income spectrum and across the education spectrum, the unemployment issue was much harder, particularly for people from low-income households and for people with low-income jobs in general. They were the hardest hit, and of course, they're the ones that are least able to bear unemployment. And similarly, for Black men and white men, we see, again, this different jumps, and you see for Black men, a larger jump, so that the Black unemployment rate for black male unemployment rate is nearly twice the white male unemployment rate by July. But there's some interesting stories that don't go along with that. One thing we know is that in general, the most vulnerable populations have been hit by the pandemic and have dealt with a lot of economic burden. But because, as Dean Pagano said in the beginning of his introduction, we had really, the early reaction was a tremendously aggressive and in some ways targeted supports for people who would be most hurt. What we've seen is some kind of surprising results. So what this graph shows is the drop in spending in low and high income neighborhoods. And so at the top, and this is relative, the amount that was spent relative to the amount that was spent pre-pandemic. And what you see up here is the high income, in high income neighborhoods, there was this tremendous drop in spending. Low income neighborhoods had less spending to start with. They also had a smaller drop in spending in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. And there were kind of two reasons for that. One reason for it is because of the supports that were put in place, income supports for unemployed people, $600 a week in unemployment that was put in by the federal government, and also by the targeted stimulus program that helped keep spending up for low-income neighborhoods. And the reason that that income fell more in high-income neighborhoods is because there were less opportunities to spend. So low-income neighborhoods are spending in general on essentials, whereas high-income neighborhoods are doing less spending on essentials, and they cut back on ancillary spending or luxury spending like air travel, things that were made impossible by the pandemic. So I think that's an interesting story. What we're concerned about, though, this is the latest data I have. The real concern is what happens moving forward now as we are not continuing the level of supports that we had early in the pandemic. Are we going to see a lot larger drop, particularly in low-income neighborhoods, and what are the effects going to be? So that's a big concern. And I just wanted to put a little context with respect to Illinois as compared to other states in terms of the economic effect. So the US Bureau of the Census very quickly ramped up to start doing surveys, and they surveyed small businesses. And they asked them, what was the effect of the pandemic on your business? And I took the data and looked at the share of businesses that said they had a moderate or large negative effect as a result of the pandemic. And what you can see here, I've graphed the data for the United States as a whole and for Illinois, and then for the states that are adjacent to Illinois. All these states touch Illinois in one way or another. And what you see, first of all, I think, is that the pattern is pretty similar. Almost all of the states, there was a significant, very bad effect early in the pandemic. And Kentucky looks a little different, but all the other states, you see a generally declining pattern over time as a smaller share of the businesses said they had a negative effect. And so there's Illinois. And you can see nearly more than 90% of businesses said it had a larger negative effect early in the pandemic, and that fell significantly by 9 weeks later. The thing is that states in this region had different patterns in terms of how much they put in place stay-at-home orders. So Indiana, very early on, the dotted red lines show you when the stay-at-home orders were relieved. Indiana, very early on, got rid of their stay-at-home order. Their pattern doesn't look terribly different than Illinois. Iowa never put any stay-at-home order in place. they still most of their businesses said they had a very large negative effect as a result of the pandemic. I think if you look at the other states, you'll see similar patterns. The timing of when you put the stay-at-home order in and when you released it didn't have a big effect on the economic impact, at least on small business, early on in the pandemic, from what we know. The lesson I take from that is that if we want to have good economic outcomes as a result of this, in spite of the pandemic, what we're going to have to do is deal with the disease. It's the disease more than any kind of policy choices that we can make that are going to restrict economic activity. And with that, I'll turn it over to Amanda and to talk about the fiscal effects. Thank you.
Can I ask one question before we turn it over?
Sure.
Amanda, if you want to pull up your slides. One question came in, which was, how does the Latinx employment fit into that picture?
You know, I haven't looked at that. In general, what we know is that the most disadvantaged groups generally suffer the most when there's economic disruption. So I didn't have a chance to pull up that data.
Thank you.
Okay, I think I've got the screen share up now. Yes. Okay, great. Thanks, David. So I'm going to talk about the fiscal impacts of the COVID recession on state and local governments. And I think importantly, and as Dean Pagano mentioned in his opening remarks, right, the finances of state and local governments are tied, and as David highlighted, it's tied to the economy. And a really big concern is that the public sector layoffs are gonna, if there are layoffs, that it will drag down the economy and leading to this kind of vicious cycle of dragging down the economy, more layoffs, and so forth. And then I also want to mention that the issue of racial inequality and justice really ties to public finance in important ways. Sometimes we don't always talk about it explicitly, but I'm going to mention it throughout my talk. I think it's something we can really think about going forward. So the impact of COVID-19 on state and city revenue collections has been severe, and it really caught places off guard. So many state and local governments' fiscal year runs from July 1st through June 30th. So COVID-19 and the economic downturn occurred in the latter part of fiscal year 2020 for most places. And this chart is showing the change in aggregate revenue for nearly 500 cities since 1996, looking specifically at three main sources of revenue. The first is the property tax, which is shown with this blue line. The second is income tax revenue, which is shown with this teal line. And the third is sales tax revenue, shown with this purple line. So you can see the sharp impact of the COVID recession on estimated 2020 revenue, and both sales and income tax revenue are estimated to have declined from the prior year. And you can see how dramatically sales tax revenue decreased. And so one thing to keep in mind, though, is that the revenue losses anticipated for 2020 that are shown in this chart happened in just a few months, right? So this is just a short amount of COVID impacting state and local revenue. And cities on average anticipate that their general fund will be about 13% less in fiscal year 2021 than it was in fiscal year 2020. So while the revenue shortfalls that have already been seen are significant, we're likely to see a downward trend in revenue for perhaps years to come. So this chart is showing the revenue trends during recent recessions. And the impact of the last recession, the financial crisis of 2008, is shown with this purple line. So the big thing to notice with this is that the depth of the revenue decline from that recession wasn't until 2012. About 6 years after that recession first started. Another thing to notice is the severity of the revenue impact from this recession, which is shown by this dashed yellow line. So this recession really stands out for the immediate and dramatic impact it's had on revenue. Whereas the last recession was slower to impact cities' revenue, this recession had this kind of immediate and dramatic impact. And that's because it impacted consumption and income taxes, whereas the last recession really impacted property taxes. This recession, this crisis isn't over yet, so we might see it also drag down property taxes in the future. In addition to declines in their own source revenue collections, cities are also likely to be impacted by state revenue shortfalls. And this is because many states share income and sales tax revenue with their local governments. So declines in state tax collections will also mean less money to cities. It's kind of a 1-2 punch. And then in addition to that, state governments might cut the amount of aid that they provide to cities as a means of plugging their own budget holes. And this is something that happened in the wake of the last recession. And so one concern I have is that the fiscal impacts of COVID-19 is going to deepen the chasm between places in good and bad financial shape. And this issue ties to race and racial inequality in important ways. So we can think, for example, of the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. Before the water crisis, that city was fiscally distressed, and the governor placed it under emergency management. And in a cost-saving measure, the state-appointed emergency fiscal manager changed Flint's water supply, which, as we know, had disastrous results, poisoning people, and the fallout of that is continuing today. So turning now to look at what's going on with the state of Illinois and city of Chicago specifically. So Illinois' fiscal year ended on June 30th. So it's now in fiscal year 2021. So the state's sales and income tax revenue was 4% less in 2020 than it was the previous year. And the state is estimating that revenue from those two taxes is going to be 7% less in 2021 than it was in 2019. And to balance the budget, the state has borrowed money for operations. It borrowed $1.2 billion for the 2020 fiscal year, and it's planning to borrow another $5 billion for 2021. Last, the state budget is going to be impacted by whether or not voters approve the fair tax amendment that's going to be on the November ballot. So this is a proposal to change the state constitution to allow a graduated income tax structure. And the rate schedule for that has already been passed by lawmakers should the amendment be approved. And if the amendment is approved, that's going to be a little over $1 billion of additional revenue that hasn't already been exactly budgeted for fiscal year 2021. So unlike Illinois, the city of Chicago's fiscal year aligns with the calendar. So the city of Chicago is still in fiscal year 2020, and that fiscal year doesn't end until December 31st. Under revised estimates, the city anticipates that local tax revenue is going to be 28% less in 2020 than was originally budgeted for. The city is also projecting a $1.2 billion deficit for fiscal year 2021 in its corporate fund budget. And so the mayor and city council have the difficult task of figuring out how to close that budget gap. And then last, for the city's contributions to its 4 pension systems are going to be increasing over time, which adds to the fiscal challenges the city is facing. So under state funding laws, the city's 2020 pension contribution is going to be a little less than a quarter more than it was for fiscal year 2021, which is just to say that even absent the current economic downturn, the city of Chicago is already facing some serious fiscal challenges. So what has the federal government done? Well, at the federal level, there's been an ongoing issue about whether or not Congress is going to pass support for state and local governments, because there's been very little thus far. In this past April, State Leader Mitch McConnell responded to questions about giving federal support to states with large unfunded pension liabilities that he'd rather see those states go bankrupt than give them support. And what federal funding has been available thus far doesn't really address the unexpected deficits that state and local governments have experienced. So there's 2 programs from the CARES Act that have provided some support to state and local governments. So the first is the Coronavirus Relief Fund, and this provides money for unexpected spending tied directly to COVID-19 that governments incur between March 1st and December 31st. But importantly, this money is not for non-COVID expenses or revenue shortfalls. So again, it can't be used to plug the deficits that resulted from declines in tax collections. So the second is the Municipal Liquidity Facility, which is a short-term loan program created by the Federal Reserve. So while all states can access it, only certain cities can. And under the initial criteria, only cities with a population of at least 1 million were eligible. And that excluded all large cities that are majority Black, like Atlanta, Detroit, and Memphis. And the criteria was expanded so that more cities were included, but the program has kind of had little use. And that's because its main purpose was stabilizing the municipal bond market. It's also a short-term loan program. So any money that governments take out has to be paid back within 36 months. And governments who have high credit ratings can get cheaper loans on the bond market rather than going through this program. So out of $500 billion available for this program, 99% of it's unused. And there's only 2 governmental entities that have used it thus far, one of which is the state of Illinois. So state and local governments have little room to maneuver as this latest crisis comes on top of years of cuts to social welfare programs and services and efforts to limit government's revenue raising capabilities through tax caps and spending limits. And how governments get revenue and what they spend it on, again, it's tied to racial inequality in important ways. So in 2017, the Chicago Tribune, for example, exposed how unfair property tax assessments created an unequal tax system in which property taxes in majority Black neighborhoods were disproportionately high. Property tax limits have also been found to disproportionately benefit white homeowners. Last, governments have turned to fines, fees, and forfeitures as a revenue source. And the city of Ferguson, for example, got 10% of its budget from petty fines and forfeitures. The reliance meant that the police were functioning as revenue collection agents, which, as we know, has had important consequences in the relationship between police and residents. It also creates inequities in revenue collection as fines, fees, and forfeitures are often disproportionately paid by non-white residents. But to end on a slightly more upbeat note, though, I think that one silver lining that can come out of the severity of the COVID-19 pandemic and recent police shootings is that it's really exposing racial inequality and violence that has long existed. And we're really seeing strong demands for change. So this creates an opportunity to think ambitiously about how to implement new policies and rethink the structures of state and local finance. I will end it on that and turn it to Mike. No.
Yeah, on to Daniel, Alderman LaSpada.
Thank you, Dean Pagano. I am really pleased to be here today to speak about what my experience of the last 15 months as a new alderman has been like, to talk about what kind of information and analysis is made available to us as we're making some of these hard decisions for the city, and then to talk about what we're facing as a municipality, the revenue losses, the potential and the reality of increased expenditures, and then how do we close that gap. So I'll say I went to UIC for the Masters in Urban Planning and Public Policy program specifically and intentionally as preparation for this experience. It's kind of surprising to me that more aldermen do not think critically about the fact that we are meant to be planners for our community, that one of our key functions is around policy and community development. And much that I'm going to speak about here today actually comes from lectures during my UPP 511 class, which was extremely formative for me. So I can say going in, I never really expected the confluence of crises that we face this year. I've joked with colleagues that in our new alderman orientations, they really should have talked about what you do in the face of once in a generation economic collapse. But that is what we're facing in terms of both the largest economic contraction since the Great Recession, Great Depression, levels of protests, looting, and civil unrest that we had not seen in 50 years, a level of a health pandemic that we had not seen in 100 years. For those three things to go together is not a crisis that I felt prepared for, but we find ourselves working in the times that we're in. What comes on top of that is aldermen facing a consolidation of power, concentration of power within the last year. And I talk about that in terms of prerogative reform. The fact that for a lot of aldermen, prerogative reform limited our ability to intervene in a meaningful sense within our communities. And it's something that is difficult to communicate to the public, the way executive order constrains power, constrains our ability to react. I also want to speak about the fact that, I mean, Amanda mentioned this, the racial inequities of our city. Those were the underlying conditions that we went into this with. We already knew that we had an affordable housing crisis, a public health crisis in terms of 30-year differences in life expectancy from one community area to another. Certainly, the COVID-19 virus crisis has laid that bare from the perspective of when we talk about the inequity in death rate for African-American Black communities, we can't also not talk about the underlying health conditions that go into that, health conditions that we have ignored for a long time. When we talk about the exceptionally high rate in Latinx communities, we also can't not talk about, unfortunately, we haven't been talking about the conditions of unstable housing, doubled and tripled up housing that can lead to higher rates of transmission. And I want to talk about the fact that our budget, when we talk about it, the mayor talks about assumptions here that can lead to both, we may see increased revenue loss, but we also may see increased expenditures. And I think that is worth us talking about. The fact that when we don't respond to upstream issues, it creates more expensive, more intensive needs down the line. If we are not dealing with the housing stability, for instance, of our neighbors, we know that down the line that's going to lead to increased evictions, increased foreclosures, a reduction in property tax payments, an increase in homelessness, deeper issues that we're going to have to deal with. A question that had been raised to me is, well, where does the council get the information and the analysis that we're working off of? And we get that from a variety of places. So certainly there's the information that we get from the administration in terms of the CAFR, the budget forecast that we received, the briefings that we've received on different ordinances that we're being asked to vote on. But I think it's worth noting that there is values that color that data. For instance, and that value, that narrative can change depending on what is the position that is being defended. For instance, I'll talk about, we had a hearing last week with the Economic Capital and Technology Development Committee, where the administration was defending its small business response, where data was shown that we had actually had a higher degree of small business reopenings than many other states and cities, although they were only using a 1 week rolling average. Now, in our budget forecast, where they want to, I would argue, defend the expectation of an austerity narrative, there we see a trend line going down for small business reopenings since early July. So the data tends to shift. I would say the same thing when it comes to TIF. Our budget forecast does have an appendice that looks at TIF, but it looks at TIF from a perspective of the number of TIF districts that have been repealed, expired, terminated. It does not look at the number of TIFs that have been opened or renewed on an annual basis. And it does not look at the revenue that is being generated, diverted into TIF districts. So there's a way that you can, and we know this as planners because it's important, that to use your data in a way that tells a narrative. And there's definitely a narrative that's being told by the city. So when my office, for instance, wants to pass legislation or really be informed, we go to multiple sources of information, even outside of the city. When it came to the budget, we leaned on groups like the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. When we're working on environmental policy, as we did with the resolution on Chicago's Drive Clean Chicago program that aims to reinvest or create incentives for the conversion of commercial fleets to hybrid and electric fleets, we turn to groups like ICNC, North Branch Works, the Southwest Environmental Justice Coalition, Neighbors for Environmental Justice, DPD. We try to bring together as much resources as possible to fully understand the scope of an issue and to understand where are the targeted responses that we can have through either resolutions or ordinances. So then the question comes to us of revenue loss and what are we going to be proposing? I want to say that the city put forward in their budget forecast last week a positive, neutral, and negative budget outlook. Even in the positive outlook, it does not show over a 3-year period even an increase or return close to normal for our corporate fund. The positive outlook shows simply a stabilization from where we are right now. The challenge for us in this is that the city does not lay bare what are the economic, health, political assumptions that underpin projections. Politically, does it speak to whether we anticipate the fair tax referendum being passed? Do we anticipate the HEROES being passed now under a Biden administration, or even a contracted relief plan that could include some form of revenue replacement? Those numbers aren't there. What are our health expectations? Does the city expect a vaccine in October, November, second quarter of 2021? This data is not there. I gotta say, like when I was watching Amanda's presentation, there is more economic statistical data in that presentation than is included in the city's budget forecast. And so for all of us, there's a need for us to, I would say, be skeptical observers of the data that is presented to us, understanding that there's a narrative behind it. One more point on that is that the budget forecast, thankfully, includes a lot of appendices, a lot of charts for us to look at. But when you look at revenue and expenditure charts, those charts only go from about 2010 to 2019. It does not actually show how the city projects our various revenue sources being affected. The only charts that go through 2023 are the debt, overall debt that were expected and our debt service payments on an annual basis. I would argue that this is really setting up aldermen and the public to expect an austerity narrative, to be willing to accept that kind of budget. But we know what follows when we pass these kinds of budgets. We know that a reduction on public services, public personnel, has long-term costs and immediate costs for the residents of our cities and states. So what do we do instead? Where can we address these revenue concerns from? One thing that we haven't, as Amanda was talking about, really fully explored is the municipal liquidity facility. How can Chicago make better use out of that? We have, in some of the hearings that we've had, talked about the city's rainy day fund. We still have a moderate but modest rainy day fund where we have been told now is not the time to go to our rainy day fund. And that's a troubling point. So when is the time? When is the time if it is not this confluence of crises? But I also want to say that there are revenue sources that we have not pursued that this may be the time to really work with the state on, even in short term. We know that our city's economy has changed, but our revenue sources have not changed to go with it. And I think that's partially why we find ourselves in this position. Chicago has never, the state has never expanded our sales tax to include services, even as services be about 65%, 60% of our economy. I think, I would argue, we're going to see or have seen a much stronger increase in those services, a stabilization of those services than we have other sectors of the economy. Even if we only start with high-level luxury services, that could be a very smart move for our city. we have not talked at all about a municipal income tax. This can seem scary to some folks, but even a marginal income tax of maybe 1% on incomes over $100,000, number one, could generate substantial revenue for the city, I would say, but also it's not something that's going to put us out of line with any of the other states that have county municipal income taxes around us. We need to get creative if we're going to have a stable city budget for years to come, if we're going to weather through what could be a protracted recovery. And it's time now for us to really think about what are those stable revenue sources that we have not explored that can put us in a more, give us a more diverse revenue base that can make our city more stable for, I would say, decades to come.
Thank you, Daniel, for the very provocative presentation. I want to pull one question out of the chat box and then have a general question for all of you. And maybe Alderman Laspada can speak to this. What about declaring bankruptcy?
I think that should be a last choice for the city of Chicago. The fact is, like our city, if we're close to bankruptcy, it's bankruptcy by intention. I will admit fully, I come from a very progressive perspective, but I think if we're having a revenue budget crisis in this city, it's not something that we're going to cut our way out of. I can speak to that through conversations with many commissioners with our city government, but we are bankrupt from a revenue perspective because we have refused to fairly tax those who can afford to pay their fair share in the city of Chicago. And even if the revenue sources I named need state action, I believe it is state action worth pushing for.
Thank you. It also would require the state to approve of it. Cities in Illinois are not permitted to go to Chapter 9 bankruptcy of the federal courts. I have a general question for David and Amanda. We hear a lot about the V-shaped recovery. Do you see a V-shaped recovery, David? And or what kind of a recovery do you see? And then Amanda, whatever David identifies as the recovery, what's the fiscal recovery? Go ahead, David.
I think it's really hard to tell. I mean, the truth is that the employment's recovered a little bit better than most economists expected it to, but of course it's also bifurcated because you know we have had less recovery in among some low-income people, and it depends on the kind of job. You know, I don't. I think it's very difficult to tell, and it's going to depend mainly, as I said before, on how quickly we can make progress against the COVID. So I don't want to hazard a guess. I'm sorry if that makes Amanda's job more difficult.
Well, I'm sorry.
I mean, I think, you know, so I think about this in a couple of ways. One is what is the financial data that is available that allows us to see what state and local governments are doing. So we can look at budgets that have been passed by states and cities. But I think, you know, that's approaching this question quantitatively. And I think that there are kind of qualitative or kind of anecdotal ways to get at this. And I think we can, all of us can think about, like, in our everyday lives, do things seem like they're getting better or worse? You know, like if you go out as planners, you know, look around and see what businesses are closed. Do we see, like, one thing I'm concerned about is what's going to happen with commercial property. So, you know, what if we see a recovery, let's say maybe in consumption, but what's coming down the line in terms of, you know, yeah, commercial property, especially since we're seeing ruptures in work, right? So I live out in California, where major employers, Google and Facebook, have announced permanent work from home policies. So what is that going to mean then for these massive footprints that those companies have had historically here? And what is that then going to mean for the local governments who've gotten revenue from the presence of those employees being concentrated?
Thank you. That's a great observation. There a question in the chat that I want to open up a little bit. The question in the chat said there hasn't been talk about responsible cutbacks in city expenses. And I'd like to link that a bit to the calls over the last several months of defunding police. Could you reflect on what sorts of expenses might be considered as expendable, and whether there is another way of thinking about what the defunding police movement might mean for the budget? Daniel, since you're I'm sure you're in the target of that all the time. Why don't we start with you? And I'd like to hear the others as well.
Certainly. I'll talk about a couple things on this. So number one, where there is inefficiency in government, it tends to be honestly to the fact that we still in this city do so much on paper. A paper system by its nature is inefficient, requires so much more staffing. But I will tell you, you can't just get off of paper by not reinvesting in IT. So every efficiency actually needs an investment to go with it. In terms of efficiency, in terms of defunding the police, what we're really talking about when we say that is equitably investing and more broadly investing in public safety. An example of this is a council order I introduced with Alderwoman Rosana Rodriguez-Sanchez today that would create an alternative public safety system modeled off of the Cahoots Feinberg Center program in Eugene, Oregon, where 20% of calls are diverted to a mental health social service network. 20% of those calls. Only 1% in their model has ever needed additional police intervention. These 20% of calls could be diverted citywide for about $150 million. It is, at the end of the day, and that's a large number to hear, it is a much more efficient and effective way of dealing with these issues than simply sending the police out to everything. And I'll say with you, like another thing is people think the answer is a slowdown in hiring from the city. We've tried this, for instance, with the law department. We always have a bunch of open positions in the law department. What happens? We end up hiring private legal counsel at fees far beyond we would pay if we just hired new attorneys for the city of Chicago. So I know that efficiency is an enticing narrative. It does not always yield the same results that people would think.
Thank you. David, Amanda?
So I'd like to comment this in a little different way. I'm by no means an expert on the city budget, but I'd like to talk a little bit about what happened, the state budget. So for 4 years, we had a Republican governor, Governor Rauner, and one of his big rallying cries was to cut waste, fraud, and abuse and to see how he could cut state spending. And as somebody who's watched the state budget closely, there were almost no proposals. So this is someone who ideologically you would believe wanted a smaller government and made virtually no proposals that significantly cut government expenditure in any way. I think because if you look at government expenditure, what does government spend the money on? Well, it spends it on K-12 schools. It spends it on healthcare for poor people, Medicaid, basically for very vulnerable populations. And it spends it on pensions, which are essentially fixed because of legal requirements. Patent. None of those big things could be cut. It's just very difficult to find efficiencies. I think we should, as public servants, we have to do that. We have to continue to work on it. We have to collect data about it. It's very hard to do.
Yeah. Amanda, thoughts on?
Yeah, I think that a lot of the, as the Alderman mentioned, I think, calls about defunding the police are also about refunding other areas of the budget. And so, I think that, and one concern I have is that the kind of political push to defund the police is going to result in this environment where governments are seeing sharp revenue declines, and that we see budget cuts to police departments, but we don't see reinvestment in other areas of the budget, like human services and other kind of welfare-based programs. And I also think that, you know, the current moment, like I mentioned, is on the heels of years and years of kind of this decline in the kind of public sector. So I think for a lot of places, they have whittled their budgets down to the bone already and are kind of like a night watchman, and that all that they're able to do is police and fire. So it's like, what is there to cut even?
Amanda, if I may, Dean, just tag onto that real quick. That's an important point. It's not that we're saying that public safety and the stability of our residents shouldn't be a top priority. We're not even saying you shouldn't spend 1.8 billion on that. We're saying you should take that 1.8 billion and spend it on the things that we know are effective in stabilizing the lives and the health of our communities. Like that's the real work.
So we have another question in the chat that I'll ask the alderman to respond to separately. But I'd like, in the last few minutes we have left, I've asked each of the panelists to pull out their crystal ball and tell us what they see happening on the economy and the fiscal side, and for the alderman in the city of Chicago. So I'm going to start again in the order that you appeared. David, in 60 seconds. So what's your crystal ball tell you?
Well, I think that the recovery of the economy is very largely going to be related to the recovery against the disease, the progress that we can make with respect to COVID-19. And then I think we also are going to be rethinking about how we go forward as an economy with respect to underprivileged groups or more challenged groups, more vulnerable groups. And I think that's going to depend a lot on the outcome of the election in November as to what path we take in that respect.
And Amanda?
I think that with great crisis, there is an opportunity for great change. And I think if I put my positive hat on, like maybe this leads to a kind of more equitable world and really rethinking the structure of state and local finance. But I will say I'm very pessimistic given kind of what we saw happen after the Great Recession. So there's an opportunity for positive change, but it's also opportunity for yet another round of austerity.
Thank you. And finally, before we turn it back to Karen, Alderman Laspada, what's your crystal ball tell you?
Cloudy. Listen, I wish I didn't see narratives and data that supported us moving towards an austerity, low expectations budget. I wish that had been my experience for the last 15 months. But I think unless we see a difference in the way the city is being governed, that we are going to experience that. And it's going to lead to more expensive crises down the road. But I know what a better path could look like, and I'm willing to fight for that.
Well, as you know, your two proposals on the income tax and broadening the sales tax base resonate well. So thank you so much, Alderman, for your contributions. And with that, I know we only have a couple of minutes left, and I'll turn it back over to Karen Corman to bid us all farewell. There are questions in the chat box if the panelists wouldn't mind responding to those before we log off here, if you could. And Karen, turn it over to you. Thank you so much. It's a terrific panel. Appreciate your perspective, David, Amanda, and Daniel. This is wonderful. Thank you so much.
Let me add my thanks to all of you, and certainly to you, Dean Picano, for leading this panel. We're so grateful for all of your time and your knowledge and sharing this wonderful conversation with us today. Just real quick, we invite you to join us tomorrow for our next Alumni Exchange event, which will be on Thursday, September 10th at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time, which will feature UIC alumna Monica Trinidad and art activist Sarah G., who are both featured in the Jane Addams Whole House Museum exhibit, True Peace, The Presence of Justice, as they compare peace organizing led by Jane Addams and women around during World War I with present-day social justice movements led by women and queer people of color that challenge prisons, policing, and demand justice. Like all of our programs, you can find out more information and register at go.uic.edu/alumni exchange. And of course, please be on the lookout for that quick survey I mentioned at the beginning of the program. Thank you again to Dean Pagano and to all of our panelists. We're very grateful for all of your time and knowledge. It's been an excellent afternoon, and we thank all of you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at a future Alumni Exchange program. Have a great rest of your day.